Blockstream on Lightning. So I've been working on the Lightning spec process for about 4 years now, which is pretty fun. And this weekend, I am looking forward to. I'm in New York City this weekend, and I'm running a Bitcoin LARP, which is a live action role play that goes through how the Bitcoin network works at it's like a fun kind of in-person game with like little like note cards and strings that we set up and run around. And Generation Bitcoin is like this organization run by some high schoolers here in New York. So I'm going to run a LARP for them in Manhattan Saturday night. So if you're around and you want to come out and hang out with some, young Bitcoiners and walk through how Bitcoin works in person in a kind of fun way, hit me up. I'm on Twitter, or, you can send me an email, nifty9@gmail.com, and I'll send you details about how to come hang out. So
That's awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Let's roll. So what I'm going to talk about, my title, which I got way too cute with, you can read it two different ways. So putting your thumb on the scale, intelligent design and the evolution of DAOs, or subtitle could be intelligent org designers and the evolution of DAOs. So we're going to, first kind of half or so will be a little more wonky and theoretical, but then the second half is really focused in on the idea of what can thoughtful DAO or organizational operators do to influence the evolution of their organizations in a positive way. And I hope is a real practical thing that we can talk about. So I'm going to start up front with just real quick about the organization that I represent, that I work for, called The Ready. We have been around since 2015. And we are a self-managed org design and transformation consultancy. And what that has meant primarily has been working with a lot of really large legacy organizations to try to help them get out of their own way, to help them be less of the bureaucratic monsters that they tend to be. So working with organizations like the Federal Reserve Bank to Charter, Sweetgreen, we really partner with these organizations and embed ourselves within them and try to help them step into new ways of working, more human, more adaptive, more equitable ways of working. And about a year ago, we became much more interested or aware of what was happening in the crypto space, particularly with DAOs. As you can imagine, us being a self-managing organization and bringing a lot of principles of self-management to our clients, became very curious about what was going on with decentralized autonomous organizations, both for ourselves, but also wondering, since we kind of had the insight that all of our client work, whether, irregardless of which industry they were a part of, their challenges often were very common. And the insight there being that anytime human beings come together to work on something, whether in a traditional organization or in a more progressive organization, some of the similar sorts of tensions start to emerge. So we were wondering if that was true in the DAO space as well, and definitely have kind of confirmed that for ourselves over the last 8 months or so, as we've worked with DAOs like Gitcoin, for example. Obviously, DAOs have some of their own unique challenges, but there's a lot of commonality as well with some of our more traditional clients. So and I've been kind of leading our DAO crypto efforts for the last year or so at The Ready. I've been at The Ready since the very beginning, employee number one. So it's been fun to kind of dive into a new aspect of our business over the last year or so. Any questions on kind of who I am or what The Ready is before I dive into this? All right, cool. So I want to give you some framework, some mental models, basically, for how to think about organizations so that we can play with these ideas a little bit later on. And the first one that's really key to understand is the difference between complicated and complex. So in colloquial, everyday use of the English language, we often use these words as synonyms, but they're really not synonyms. They actually describe very different types of systems. And I want to talk a little bit about what those differences are. So here we have a watch on the left, an engine on the right, and these represent what we would call complicated systems. So they are inherently they are inherently knowable. They may be very intricate. They may have a lot of components to them, and you may need a lot of expertise to understand what's going on in these systems. But if you are a master watchsmith and I bring you a busted ass watch, you can figure out what is wrong with it. You can see what parts are broken and know because this part is broken, this sort of result is going to happen. I can fix this. I can put it back together. Same thing, if you're a master mechanic and I bring you my car, you can analyze that system, see how it's broken, and then bring it back to its previously functioning state, or maybe even a little bit better. So totally knowable. We're not dealing with probabilities here. We're dealing with pretty causal relationships. But the weather or traffic, also systems where lots of things are interacting with each other, but these are fundamentally different than something like a watch or an engine. We are dealing much more in the realm of probability, of forecasting, of simulation to really understand what is going on in these organizations. Regardless of how much data you have about a region's weather system, you can't make the same level of prediction that you could if I brought you a broken engine and you're a master mechanic. And as you can imagine, these systems interact very differently. And if you are interacting with a complex system, but in your mind, you're thinking it's a complicated system, you're going to be confused or frustrated or just not really understand what's going on. And in many ways, that describes how a lot of people think about organizations, at least a lot of traditional organizations. So complicated, we're in the realm of sensing, analyzing, and responding. Whereas for a complex system, if you want to really understand what's going on in that complexity, you have to interact with the system, see how it responds to you, and then you can respond to that. And if we think about our organizations as complicated, then we do things like top-down reorganization efforts, top-down change management, a bunch of leaders going off into a room, coming up with a plan, and then rolling it out waterfall style to the rest of the organization. It very rarely goes well, and everybody is kind of left frustrated. The people who came up with the plan are frustrated. The people who are being told what to do in the plan are frustrated. And it's just a mismatch of reality to expectation. So the first thing to really have in our minds as we're thinking about our own organizations and the DAOs that we may be a part of is to really understand that we're dealing with complexity. And because we're dealing with complexity, we're not going to be able to necessarily kind of plan and control our way into the precise future that we want. The takeaway is not that we can't interact with a complex system or steward or push a complex system into a better configuration for us. It's just that what that looks like is going to be very different than a more kind of mechanistic view of the world. So along with that idea of complexity and complicatedness is a metaphor that I think, again, adds a little bit more texture to what's going on in our organizations. So you can think about an organization as having an operating system. And this is the foundational layer of beliefs and assumptions and principles that shape the way of working of the organization. And it's hard to kind of interact with this operating system directly. I think, even thinking about the operating system on your computer or on your phone, very few people are actually interacting with that code specifically or directly, but everything that you do run and interact with rides on top of that operating system. So I think it is useful to think about our organizations as having kind of a similar sort of dynamic, that there's a whole world of stuff that we don't necessarily see in the day-to-day that affects what we do actually interact with in our organizations. So let's look at an example that's not organizationally related, but it might be somewhat illuminating. So here we have a situation that is the same on both sides. The scenario is the same. You have two roads coming together at a 90-degree intersection. We need people to be able to safely navigate this scenario. But we have two very different operating systems at play here. On the left, we have maybe what feels more normal to at least Americans. We have far and away more traffic lights than anything else. And on the right, we have a roundabout. So let's think about just look at the traffic light version first. What are some of the assumptions that are baked into this operating system?
People know how to observe a red versus green stoplight.
Yeah, people know to look for it. People know what those symbols mean, and that we're all going to kind of follow that for sure. What else?
Yeah, I guess there's just, when you approach the red light, all of the, kind of like the operating system that you're encountering, to stop. And like sometimes there's like red on red, sometimes there's not, but you can assume you can turn, like red on red. And or you assume that everyone else will be following the same kind of set of rules that you learn when you take the test when you're 16
right.
or however old.
Yeah, totally fair. Wilson, I see you said it's more efficient than letting people directly decide how to take turns. That may be the case, although I wonder how many of you have ever sat at a red light at like 3 a.m.
Well, you asked what are the assumptions? Like,
oh, okay, yeah, go ahead.
If they thought otherwise.
Fair. Okay, yeah, you're right. So that is an assumption, and that assumption may not actually hold, is what the point I was saying. Anything else?
I guess as the driver, you are like basically surrendering all of the control of the decision making to the stoplight. Like you have to follow the stoplight, or I mean, if you don't, there's a lot of negative consequences. So yeah, like you're surrendering kind of your decision making power as a driver of what you can do. Then you're waiting to be directed.
Totally, and kind of as a corollary to that is that you can like kind of turn your brain off when you're sitting at a red light. Like you don't have to be super aware of what is going on around you. I mean, I'm sure none of us do this, but other people maybe look at their phone when they're waiting at a red light. You can turn your brain off for sure. The other thing that I would just point out for this one, there's definitely an assumption that we're going to have electricity and that, it'll always be electrified so that it's always running. And if it's not, then we maybe have a bit of a challenge here. Cool. Let's look at the right-hand side now. So same scenario. We need to safely navigate intersections, but we have a different sort of system in place here. What are the assumptions and behaviors that you see in this operating system?
I mean, again, you know how to navigate it, right? If you're in the UK, whether you're going left, or if you're in continental Europe, you're going right or whatever.
Yeah. So there are some like basic rules that you need to have internalized or be aware of to be able to safely navigate it. Generally, I think there's kind of like 3 rules that you have to follow. Yield to cars already in the roundabout. Don't stop. So if you like missed your turn, like just keep going around. And a third one that I can never remember, but is equally simple. Maybe one of you can come up with it. What else is what other behaviors or assumptions do you see baked into this sort of operating system? Maybe in contrasting to the traffic light.
I mean, I think the don't stop is the biggest one. Like you said it already, but very clear, different approach. I'm expected to stop half the time on the left-hand side, and I'm never expected to stop on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
I feel like the right hand side run with the roundabout is more of like a chaotic, like experiential thing. Like I feel like it's the sort of thing you kind of like drive into, and like there's no ritualistic like outcome of like how your passage through the roundabout is going to end up. Whereas like with the traffic lights, like there's kind of like this predefined protocol that you sort of need to know. Like you need to understand that red means stop, right? And maybe you can pick that up from context clues of what other people are doing. But it's got like sorry, I'm like a protocol person.
No, it's fine.
The protocol, like the traffic light has like a protocol which you like have to learn. But once you know the protocol, it's got like a very orderly process and it's like repeatable, right? So like there's like this repetitive like situation that happens at every like cycle of the light, so to speak. I don't know.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. One thing that I would add and this is I think in contrast to maybe something Shelby said about the one on the left, but like you have to be in interaction, in relationship to what is happening in the roundabout in order to like safely navigate it. Like if you approach a traffic light intersection and it's red, turn your brain off, wait for green, whatever. As you approach a roundabout, you got to see like, all right, who's coming around? Do I need to slow down? Do I need to yield to them? Like you have to be in relationship to it. So it's a very kind of different mindset that you need to have to safely navigate it. So if you were, if you were the city manager, city planner, making decisions about like, all right, what are we going to put in here? Traffic light, roundabout. There are some objective sorts of outcomes that you probably would care quite a bit about, like which one has higher output, like what's more efficient, which one has fewer fatal accidents, maybe fewer accidents with serious injuries, which one's cheaper to maintain, which one works in a power outage. And all of those things that I just said, also roundabouts do take up more space. That's right. That's my second point here. All those other things that I said, roundabouts are far and away more effective. Very few fatal accidents in a roundabout, because if you do collide, you're kind of low speed and glancing off each other instead of T-boning each other at 45 miles an hour. Cheaper to maintain, works in a power outage. Actually, at peak traffic, they have higher flow than traffic lights. You're never going to get stuck at a roundabout by yourself at 3 a.m. unless you're choosing to, I guess, for some weird reason. So roundabouts are like far and away better. And the takeaway is not like, all right, like let's get all the traffic lights out of here, put roundabouts in everywhere. No, that's not going to work. They take up more space. Imagine Manhattan, every intersection being a roundabout. Like that would be chaos and non-feasible across lots of different reasons. But considering how much better roundabouts are, it's curious that there aren't just more of them in more places in the United States and probably just across the world as well. And we could really dive into that. There's probably some very interesting histories around that. But it really, I think one of the things that comes down to is just they feel less known to us. They're just less familiar, and people are more comfortable doing the thing that is control and compliance based, even if it is less effective and more dangerous than doing the roundabout thing. So we've already kind of danced around this. The traffic light is an example, kind of more of a control and compliance based OS, and the roundabout is more of a trust and autonomy based OS. And as I said, the takeaway is not that we should make our organizations purely roundabouts everywhere. There is a time and a place where we need to have more of a control and compliance focused operating system. But at least with most of our legacy clients, they seem to default to control and compliance, which is really kind of coming out of that mechanistic view of how they think organizations work, when they would really stand to benefit from having more trust and autonomy baked into how they are working. So to visualize our operating system a little bit better, we created a tool called the OS Canvas. And these are just 12 fields, 12 areas that every organization has answers to these questions, or they have assumptions and principles and behaviors and practices baked into how they do these 12 various things, from purpose in the top left, which is all about how we orient and steer, what rituals and practices and assumptions do we have about organizational purpose, to meetings, how we convene and coordinate, what are the assumptions about how we run meetings here, or what purpose meetings have, to compensation, how do we actually pay and provide for our members, and what are the assumptions that are baked into all of our decisions around that. So this tool has just been a helpful way to kind of start to show where there are potential levers to pull on within our various organizations. And obviously, the canvas as it is currently laid out here is a value neutral sort of tool. It's not telling you what the answer should be in each of these. It's just saying there are decisions to be made in these various fields of the canvas. So when it comes to the question then of like, well, what should we fill our operating system with? It kind of falls into two buckets for us coming out of the research that we did for our founder, Aaron Dignan's book called Brave New Work, where we were looking at lots and lots of examples of organizations that seem to just be doing things differently than kind of the status quo. And we're seeing outsized results from that. So organizations like Handelsbanken or Bertsorg or Morningstar, these self-managing organizations, the things that they were doing differently tended to fall into one of these two buckets. So people positivity They had beliefs that people are naturally motivated and capable of self-direction and that worthy of trust and respect, and that really people are chameleons. They will modify their behavior based on the environment that they're in. So if we have this belief that people are trustworthy and that they can actually do great work, and we don't need to be standing over them as managers with punishment and incentives to make them do things, then people will generally rise to the occasion and do great things. And then on the right-hand side, complexity conscious, this is getting back to that idea that they had practices and principles and beliefs that really show that they understand that their organization is more like the weather than it is a broken watch that can just be easily fixed. So organizations are complex systems, which means they can't be predicted or controlled to the level that we may wish they could be, and that we have practices that kind of respect that. So then this last kind of key idea, called continuous participatory change, but how do you actually start to get an organization on a trajectory of positive change, of becoming what we would call an evolutionary organization, is this basic process of noticing tension. So not interpersonal tension, but tensions that live somewhere in the OS canvas. Generally, we would get a team together and try to just get them to start articulating like how things are going in these various spaces. And often you see a couple of the fields of the canvas start to become the obvious problem areas where we can start doing some initial experimentation. So you get good at talking about tension, then you have a wide array of practices to consider. You just have a really deep toolbox of practices that you are aware of or have experience with that may help address that tension. And these are where you want the people positivity and complexity consciousness to come in. And then you're designing a specific experiment that is safe to try, that teaches us whether or not that practice is actually going to work in our context. Because what we really don't want to do is just copy and paste things we have seen work in other organizations, because the context around each org is very different. And we should not assume that something that worked in one place, even in a seemingly very similar organization, is going to work the same in ours. So we got to experiment our way into it, which uncovers new tensions, and we continue this process for forever. And the interesting thing is when this just becomes embedded in how every team in the organization works and how we talk about what is going on in our organization, that's when you start to see like truly scaled change across these thousands or hundreds of thousands of person organizations. So that's kind of the spiel around like the ready business as usual. The thing that I wanted to layer on top of this for our discussion later this afternoon is to try to understand a little bit better what is going on within the organization, and how to steward these experiments or steward these changes so that they are actually useful and good and help us move in a positive direction and kind of just aren't chaos. So I thought that what it most seems like is going on can be described through really an evolutionary process. So while this may be the most common view of how people think about evolution, it is certainly not accurate in the sense of like, it is not this clean. It is not this linear. We did not just go, there were not just kind of like four steps between the chimp and the human. Instead, I want us to think about how natural selection works in evolution. So this idea that in nature, mutations happen when animals are reproducing, and they're mostly random. It's just a matter of just probability that there's going to be some sort of genetic mutation is actually quite high. What is low is whether or not, or what is less likely is that genetic mutation is going to have any sort of impact on the organization, on the animal's reproductive success. So, a genetic mutation that has no effect on whether or not an individual is more likely to reproduce is not going to spread throughout the population. And that's the vast majority of mutations that happen. They just have no effect, and therefore they don't really propagate. The second most common thing is that you have a genetic mutation that actually makes the individual less fit for their environment. They're less likely to reproduce. So obviously at that point, that genetic mutation is not going to spread throughout the population. It is only a very low percentage of genetic mutations that actually somehow make that individual more likely to reproduce. So the example in the image here, you have a bird, a finch, who has a genetic mutation that allows it to exploit a food source that it normally can't access. And because it now has access to greater nutrition, perhaps it grows larger, perhaps it becomes more attractive to a mate, it is more likely to reproduce than those who don't have that genetic mutation, and that genetic mutation spreads throughout the population. So that's like the real kind of like evolution 101 sort of thing that's going on with natural selection. And what I want us to do is kind of layer that on top of what is happening within organizations, and thinking about the organizational operating system as sort of the genome of the organization. The way that we would fill out the operating system for the ready, the way we would fill out, you know, how we think about purpose and the practices that we have around it, how we think about strategy and the practices that we have around it. For each of these fields of the canvas, we give a bit of a genetic thumbprint for what type of organization we are. And if we want to become more fit for our environment, what sorts of mutations within these 12 fields of our operating system do we want to instigate, support, help spread throughout the organization so that we become a better fit for our environment? And what sorts of mutations are actually detrimental? And can we see them ahead of time and try to cut them off before they cause too much harm? So to play with this metaphor a little bit, I tried to define kind of like what are the corollaries for each of these. So an organizational mutation would be experiments in how we do things here. They're basically just our answers to those various fields of the canvas. They're the practices and processes and methods and thought technologies that exist within our operating system. So reproductive success as an org is a little bit fuzzier, I think, because not every organization has the same purpose or the same thing that they're shooting for. You know, a social DAO is looking for something very different than a DAO that is creating software or protocol. So I think it's really kind of dependent on the organization, but I would imagine some version of greater effectiveness, greater happiness of the folks who are working in that organization, more productive, better vibes, other things like that. But generally, I think it would probably fall into those more people positive and complexity conscious sorts of things. And then the last thing I wanted to just touch on was this idea of emergence. And I think a lot of times people talk about emergence in self-managing organizations, self-organizing systems as just like a thing that kind of happens at some point. There's a lot of hand waving around like, well, we don't need to make structure, or we don't want to like put any guardrails in place because the right thing will emerge. And if you know anything about kind of how emergence happens in nature, you know that you actually do need structure. You need guardrails for that emergence to happen. A common example that we point to, you think about a murmuration of starlings, you know, those thousands of birds that are making these really intricate patterns in the sky. That's not like a pre-programmed thing where they all got together and decided like, we're gonna make this pattern today. All it is those thousands of individual birds following three basic rules of don't bump into each other, generally go in the same direction as the birds around you, and generally steer towards the center of mass of the birds around you. You have all of those following those simple rules, you get that really complex behavior that emerges. So I think when we're talking about wanting the right mutations to emerge within our organization, we need guardrails to help constrain what is actually useful and what is not. And I think those are the principles, values, and purpose of our teams or of our organization, which I'll talk more about here in a second. So the thing that I want us to carry into our last little section here, just a couple of questions to kind of have bouncing around your head. So as thoughtful operators, how can we inspire, catalyze, nurture, steward, spread, other positive verbs, the organizational genetic mutations that make our DAOs or our orgs more fit? And how also can we steer around, diminish, squash, avoid the genetic mutations that make our DAOs less fit? Which basically is what I'm asking is, can we be intelligent designers rather than being at the whims of randomness? Evolution in nature is a random affair. That's why the vast majority of genetic mutations have either no effect or a deleterious effect. We can do better than that because we don't have millions of years for our DAOs to become better versions of themselves we need our organizations to be incredibly effective because they're our best shot at solving some of the most wicked problems that we have in our world right now. So can we put our thumb on the scale as intelligent designers and help evolution kind of go a little bit faster in our orgs? So my provocation, or my last really practical thing for us to think about, is what are the roles then of the intelligent org designer? What sorts of things can we do to help steer evolution within our organization? So I came up with 6. There are undoubtedly others that I did not think of, and I would love if you have other thoughts about these, but this is what I am seeing. So I'll do a minute or so on each of these. The green sticky will be just my title for it. The yellow is my 1-sentence explanation. The blue stickies are potential activities or things that this person or someone holding this role would do. And then pink, anything that's pink, is a link to another resource related to it. I'll share this mural with you all after the talk, and you can explore some of these things in greater detail as you want. And when I say role, I don't mean like we hire someone specifically to do this. I talk about role as like in the holacracy sense, in the sense that we are all holding a portfolio of roles, and we can step into and step out of them, but none of us are like one person, one role in our organization. We all wear many hats. So these are the various hats. So the catalyst, I think especially relevant if you have any sort of positional power in your organization. This is essentially modeling by working in public and sharing context such that it is likely to inspire new mutations throughout the organization. So there are some folks at the Ready who do this really well, who are who regularly, every week or every 2 weeks, share a 1-pager of what they've been working about and what they've been thinking about. And they've been thinking about is actually the more interesting and helpful thing that often inspires me to try something new in my area of the organization that I have control over. So by working and failing in public, you can inspire new, useful organizational mutations. And really anybody can do that, but it has a greater effect if other people are already looking to you as an example. The scaffolder, this is helping the right mutations evolve by creating useful constraints. So I was talking about purpose, principles, and values before as being one way to conceptualize them is as constraints. I think sometimes articulating purpose, principles, and values can feel like excessively navel-gazy if we don't actually use these things in the future. So I think this is how you can make that effort worthwhile, is to conceptualize these as constraints. So having a really clear organizational purpose can answer the question of mutations toward what end? Like what are we trying to move closer to? Any mutation that helps us do that is probably worth exploring. Principles then are mutations about what? If we have certain principles that we really believe in, then can we come up with mutations that help us embody or institutionalize or operationalize these principles even more? And then values, I think, can be thought of as guardrails around what's a tolerable mutation. So without having articulated our values, we could see a potential mutation that'll move us toward our purpose, but maybe we have to like really violate our values, what we believe, how we want to act. And if you haven't ever really articulated those, then maybe you make that decision and it creates turmoil within the organization, whether kind of explicit or implicit. So having that articulated really helps us steer around like, all right, we're going to do this, but not at the expense of this other thing. So as a thoughtful operator or leader in your organization, you can do things like hosting moments and venues where these topics can be discussed, debated, and consented to, even just at the team level. So perhaps you don't have the positional power to steer the whole organization in a certain direction, but even just on the team or the area where you do have influence, having a clear purpose, principles, and values I think can be really valuable. And then making artifacts that codify current thinking about those things is super useful. The cultivator is all about creating the conditions where useful mutations can actually survive. So if anytime anybody tries something new in your organization, it immediately gets shot down. If the organizational antibodies come out in force every single time, then there going to be no mutation. It's going to be pure. It's going to be purely static. And that is a recipe for an organization to eventually die. So thinking about what can you do to make it a better place for deliberate experimentation, disciplined experimentation to actually happen. Things and rituals and routines around celebrating noble failure, making it so that it's okay to try new things and that your reputation doesn't get destroyed if something you tried doesn't actually work out as we thought it would. And I think creating an environment where mutational velocity is increased allows us to iterate faster. So that little animation that we have there, those two blue circles are moving at the same speed. So you could say these two organizations are operating at the same speed, but because the cycle time is so much shorter on the organization on the right, it goes through more cycles of sense and respond in the same amount of time that the larger, slower, not slower, but less frequent cycle time organization on the left. So what are the types of things that you can do so that we are rapidly iterating and experimenting in ways that are not chaotic, but are actually helping us uncover useful things faster? 3 more. So the connector, helping useful mutations spread across the organization, maybe less relevant if your organization is small, very relevant if your organization is quite large. And this is basically just a person who is explicitly always thinking about what is happening over here that may be useful over here. I am always surprised how small of an organization you can have where you'll have 2 people who never really interact with each other. We have 40 people at the Ready. There are a handful of folks at the Ready who I only talk to at our trimesterly in-person retreat. And usually even then, only for a couple of minutes. That 40 people is not that many. So it is very unlikely that if they're doing something really cool in their part of the organization and they're not working in public, I'm not going to necessarily be aware of that. But if there are folks who are good at making those connections happen, then you can have one useful mutation in one part of the organization spread to other parts. The reflector, this is all about helping teams uncover their own needs. Most teams are very heads down on their actual work and are resistant to making space to reflect on their own processes. It can sometimes feel like working on the organization is less important than working in the organization. So it is helpful to have someone who is very good at helping teams hold that space so that they can run a retrospective on what is going on in their team and make decisions about how to steer out of whatever is not working particularly well for them. We do these sessions called tensions and practice sessions that are really about a team getting better at talking about their tensions and then matching it up with a potential practice that they may want to try. This afternoon, if you have some time, you can check out this link, which is a digital tool of 75 of the most common organizational tensions that we've seen in our traditional clients. And I've put this list in front of lots of DAOs, and I would say the vast majority of these tensions are relevant to DAOs as well. And then the last one, which is always the thing that makes me feel like I'm about to get hit by lightning, is the role is just, you can just be God in this. And what I mean by that is you can just bring mutations and plop them into parts of the organization where you think they may actually have a positive impact. This is about having the deepest toolbox of experiments and practices and tools of anyone in your organization so that you can offer them in places where you see where they could potentially be helpful. And there's nuance around here. What I'm not saying is like compel people to go do things differently because you have this thing that you think will help, but offering them, being a resource to help implement these ideas. I think, there is a whole world of practices out there that come from other self-managing organizations. I mean, maybe even other organizations that you've worked for in the past that did this one thing really well that you've always thought about wanting to bring to your current role. There are literally thousands of things that you can learn more about and just be familiar with so that if you see a moment, if you see a tension existing in your organization, you can run through your Rolodex, your mental Rolodex of practices and say like, hey, like, have we tried doing this thing? It's like we have a tool here that's our companion to the practices, which is 75 progressive organizational practices that range from the really small and specific to like really broad and not anything that you could like just implement in one go, but could be enough to get your brain going on like what we could do differently. So again, I encourage you to check that out later this afternoon as well. I also went through my Goodreads of every book that I've read in the last 10 years that I thought had anything to do with how we do work and think about work at the Ready. So I'm calling it the Ready Canon, according to me. I don't have the authority in our self-managing organization to say this is the official canon, but there's a bunch of books here that I think are relevant to anybody who cares about how organizations work. And then this last thing, which is super, super work in progress, but I invite any of you to jam on it if you want to, which is trying to think through what is the minimum viable practice that a DAO or org should have in each field of the canvas to consider themselves on the right path. We've been trying to think about, if we're going to take a DAO from season 0 through season 1, what's the minimum viable thing they need across those 12 fields? So you can see what I have initially dumped in here, what a couple of my colleagues have added. If you have thoughts, I'd love for you to jam on that as well, or maybe that's something that you can work on this afternoon. Totally up to you. So we're getting here to the very end. I know for those of us on the East Coast, getting toward lunchtime, I want to close with just one last thought. There's this principle, this law called Gall's law. And what it says, I'm going to read it out loud here. So a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. The inverse proposition also appears to be true. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be made to work. You have to start over, beginning with a working simple system. And what I see in this is a caution to people like me, people and you probably. We are smart. We want shortcuts. We see where we want to go. And we are always tempted to kind of make that jump into the more complex thing that we're pretty sure is going to work. And very rarely does it actually work. So I'm hoping what I just shared here about these relatively small mutations that we can make on our organizations allows us to not get screwed by Gall's law and actually create DAOs and organizations that are more effective, better fit for their environment, and actually allow us to have a shot at solving all of the really gnarly things that we're hoping our organizations might actually be able to do in the future. Boom, done. Barely on time, 11:30, 11:29. Nailed the timing. I guess if you have any questions right now, like I'm happy to answer one or two, but then I know we'll come back this afternoon. So.
No, Sam, that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
and thank you for sharing this, or when you do share this. This is
I'll throw it in the chat right now.
Yeah, a lot of resources in here.
Oops, yeah, do this. Okay, cool. Well, let's we're taking a break now, right, Matt?
Yeah, so it's break time, whether that's lunch or dinner or late breakfast. We've been through this, as we said off the top yesterday, went through the whole breakout session or discussion session format. So as you're chewing on what Sam shared, think ahead to us getting into the more workshop format, and any questions that have percolated up, and also thinking through when we get into our thematic grouping exercise, how we can imagine applying what we've learned here to each of our DAOs so we can jump right into the session and fill it with sticky notes. Other than that, unless there's any questions, comments, or special requests, we can take a break.